The title of the panel is Gangs Insights from India, Colombia and Jamaica. So it's an eclectic mix with a kind of cross geographic focus, and I think is going to provide some very, very interesting insights. My name is John Collins. I'm Director of Academic Engagement at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm also Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development. And we've published, I think, work on all of these areas actually in the past. So we have a fascinating lineup of presentations today, which will be followed by a Q&A. So please do feel free to drop your questions during the discussion, but also if you feel like holding them for afterwards as well. So first up, we have Sangeeta Roy, who has a PhD from the Institute of Social Sciences in India. And her doctoral research focuses on ethno-migrant masculinities among school-going Bihari youth in Calcutta. And that gives us some critical insight on the construction of young people in crime. So I'll hand over to Sangeeta now. I think you're muted, Sangeeta.
Thank you, John. Yes, so my presentation today is situated within the area of internal migration within India from one eastern state to a neighboring other. And I engage with the ways in which adolescent boys of ethno-migrant descent and how they negotiate their identification as the bad boys to be able to claim and continue their education at a public school. And drawing on ethnographic data from my doctoral research in a public school in Kolkata in Eastern India, I interrogate the synonymous association of adolescent gang boys. So how adolescent gang boys are within the framework of ethno-migrant masculinity, and how this how we can interrogate the idea of ethno-migrant masculinity with criminalization and the implications that such association has for adolescent gang boys to be recognized as schoolboys. So when these ideas of a particular ethno-migrant masculinity and their association with crime, when they become synonymous to the social imaginary of a country or a particular state or its people, and when these boys also would like to access their education at a particular school or access the location of learners, how I aim to see how they have to negotiate between competing scripts of ethno-migrant masculinities. So briefly about the context, West Bengal and Bihar are two states in eastern India, and populations from Bihar constitute some of the largest numbers of laboring migrants in West Bengal, but also in the rest of India. And labor migration from rural Bihar to various urban centers in India is particularly high. But also in the social imaginary of India, but also to the Bengali population of West Bengal, per se, a Bihari is often connotative of a poor underclass laboring migrant as a people in crime. And this is sort of exacerbated by media images of Bihari populations in crime. And scholars argue that these representations more often occlude the socio-political circumstances and reinforce a certain biologism about a people, a people of a particular state who speak several languages, who have particular cultures, but are now connotative as a people in crime. So, but what is also interesting, and I'm coming back to Kolkata and the specific experiences of my field work here, is to say that how adolescent, I looked at how Bengali upper class and upper castes, and upper castes are also, and more often upper classes and upper middle classes, have over time, over the 19th and 20th centuries, have been able to consolidate themselves as a people of intellect, as precursors of a cultural renaissance in India. What happens when adolescent Bihari youth who were born, raised, and have been attending school in the city and have to negotiate these schooling structures And this also means that they have to negotiate their own identification as a criminal ethnic group, as a criminal masculinity with another culture, with an ethnic group that situates itself as a people of intellect, as a people of class. So I come back to the participants of my research, who were all in the age group of 17 and 18 in the final 2 years of schooling. They were all born, raised, and they have been staying in Calcutta. And all of them self-identify themselves as the bad boys, and with a line that recurs as a decisive assertion in the introductions, where, and I quote, only bad boys can make a good city, thereby asserting their position as part of a parallel system of power, of justice, of setting new rules for righting the wrongs in the near absence of a socio-administrative structure that trusts them or is about or would like to secure them. And at the same time, this nature of a benevolent and almost a vigilante code of which they are a part is not just one that they use to secure themselves or to secure their own ethnic group. Interestingly, it is this code that they extend in the well-being of people, also people who are part of the dominant ethnic group, the Bengalis. So they look at themselves as securing people, senior people, people in difficult circumstances, in medical emergencies, in a range of and it, but in the absence of other structures that will secure them. And interestingly, what happens is that their way of securing these securing people or ensuring safety or supporting people is one that also involves significant degrees of violence and threat, thus reinforcing the idea of themselves as criminal gang boys to the popular and dominant imagination of the city. So the question is, it's also interesting that schooling for these boys, these final 2 years of schooling, is not really a family decision. It's a personal decision for many of these boys who have either returned to school after a gap of a few years, or have been or are being able to continue in school despite functioning as almost as the heads of their households in their families, despite the presence of other adults. So when these boys enter school, the school authorities reinforce a structure of foreboding, of caution, of increased surveillance and criminalization, and the school continues to perpetrate this image of the Bihari male criminal physiognomy, a Bihari criminal comportment, through a process of ethnification. And we see that a vast array of actions or inactions, actions such as sitting in the classroom or climbing stairs, smiling or not smiling, staring or looking away, are all given the meaning of a criminal intent. And we also see that many of the manner in which the boys do their bodies, by of the manner of wearing the uniform, by tightening the arms, the chest, maintaining a faux hawk hairdo, all of these are identified as symbols of criminal intent. And we also see that the school escalates a whole range of usual normal situations to reinforce the idea that the boys have come to school to create disruption. So in the sense, asking questions, seeking clarifications, or contradicting the teacher are all seen as symbols of a criminal intent. So I'll just give you a single example. In one instance, a boy asks for a key to a bicycle. So the key is thrown at the other boy. It misses the eye of the teacher by an inch or two. And then the boy is accused of wanting to kill the teacher, of plotting bloodshed, of planning to kill without provocation. So in this environment of increased accusations of criminal intent, which becomes synonymous to their Bihari identity, the only way in which the boys are able to continue their education is again by operating as bad boys, by coming together as bad boys, and that's by compelling the teachers and the school to extend an education to them. And this is also interesting because the school is aware of the circumstances of these boys, many of whom also do not come from families. So which means that gang of bad boys is also one of social support for them. So their functioning as a collective outside the school is often brought into the school. And so, for instance, if there's any particular thing that belongs to one boy in the school, it is assumed to belong to everybody. And it operates like a brotherhood. If there is an accusation against one boy, all the boys go to dissipate the circumstances, to apologize, to create more humor, and to resolve it. If there is a roll number that is called out for each boy at the beginning of each class, instead of that boy, there are many other boys who are responding for that boy, because we are all brothers, and it's fine for one to respond for the other. And in this way, when a single boy is punished, everyone wants to be punished. And when these processes of operating together are not recognized by the school as a way to find social support, these behaviors often reinforce them as a gang of bad boys who now have come into the school to defile the school. And it's also important, I think, to mention that while I look at ethnic identity and ethno-masculinity, since the study is based in India, we have to remember that caste is a very important stratifier, and a central aspect of caste is the functioning of this binary of purity and pollution. So many of these ideas of caste, particularly pollution, defilement, dirt, is then translated from caste into ethnic identity, and that is how the boys are imagined. And in the absence and in an environment of increased surveillance and punishment, what happens is the boys often claim that dominant image of themselves as the bad boys, and utter things like, "I will enter the class like a wanted because I want an education." But by reinforcing that idea of the wanted, or by creating dents and cracks and holes in the school as a retaliation to when they were insulted, they sort of reinforce that image of the bad boys. And but what I think is interesting in this process is that not merely it is it the accusation of a criminal masculinity, but how in this process of wanting an education, the boys inadvertently almost reinforce stereotypes about themselves, stereotypes about cultural inadequacy, about bodies without a mind, about criminal intent. And while the social resources to access that dominant masculinity is available to them, and thus to perform a compliant, neat child in the school, these resources are not useful, because outside the school, they're living the life of an adult, and that adult life in which boys also secure a range of responsibilities of their families, which can include securing the dowries of elder sisters, securing the school education of younger brothers, taking care of the business, and also being part of the gang. This childlike disposition of the school is not particularly useful for them. So I think what these boys essentially do is that they trouble that normative, what they call the normative, docile, individualistic idea of the good boy, and who works in self-interest and then present the alternate idea of the bad boy, and as they say, who are the criminals who can also operate in the interest of other people and are prepared to go to prison in the interest of other people at the margins. So that's all. Thank you.
Apologies, Sangeeta, I couldn't find my unmute. Thank you very much. Very interesting opening discussion. And so let's go straight into Alina next. So Alina Budi is from the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, a great institute that GI has worked with many times in the past. She focuses on urban anthropology. She's a human practitioner and participatory filmmaker expert on youth gangs and organized crime in Latin America. And she has a PhD from Oxford. So please take it away, Alina.
Thank you so much, John, for the intro, and it's great to be part of such a geographically diverse panel. I find very often discussions on gangs are very regional. At least I often find myself within the kind of Latin American crowd, and it will be very interesting, I think, in the discussion to draw on this kind of inter-regional kind of similarities or differences. Anyway, so the talk I will share today is based on sort of a decade-long research that I started with my PhD and then continued through the years, which I conducted ethnographic research, which I conducted in and around Medellin, Colombia's second biggest city, particularly trying to understand the lived experiences and the experience of criminal involvement among adolescents that occupy the bottom level. And I will explain what I mean by this, but the kind of lower echelons of contemporary gangs in Colombia. And the kind of rationale for this particular paper that I present today is understanding that we have witnessed around the globe, and certainly Latin America, in recent decades, important transformations in gang cultures and structures, particularly following the involvement of many gangs in illicit economies, most prominently the drugs economy, the transnational and local drug trafficking, but also other illicit economies. We have seen what, for instance, Venkatesh and Levitt have theorized as a corporatist turn in gang dynamics, meaning that gangs are no longer sort of street corner peer groups of kids that hang out with each other and are tied by brotherhood ties and sort of alternative families for kids, but they have increasingly become more market-driven and more operating like corporations, right? So more providing, rather than providing an alternative to family and socialization, more providing an alternative to lacking jobs. So it's linked also to the increasing sort of economic precarity in job search that we see in many places around the world. And a lot of literature has sort of investigated how have these transformations affected gang communities' relationships, particularly making gangs more extractive towards local communities. But the question that really drives this paper is how have these transformations affected the lived experiences of young people at the bottom of gang, of young people that approach, sort of start entering their gang life. And the main argument I want to advance here is twofold. First of all, I argue that, at least in the Colombian context, we have gone one step further than this corporatist turn to what I call the neoliberal turn in gang dynamics, meaning that not only have gangs become more market-driven, but they have also appropriated some of the characteristic business models of neoliberalism, such as the franchise model or the gig economy model. And I will explain later in the presentation what I mean by this. And second, I argue that this shift has resulted in the further precarization of the criminal experience for adolescents that approach gang life, in the sense that while adolescents join gang under the sort of illusion of social and economic emancipation, their involvement in contemporary gangs increasingly resembles an extremely precarious, low-paid and high-risk job, a situation that I call augmented precarity. So in the course of this presentation, I will first sort of cover a little bit of context of placing these young people within the framework of organized crime and gangs in Colombia. Second, I will try and draw a parallel between the functioning of gangs and sort of gig economy platforms. And finally, I will sort of explain what I mean by this concept of augmented precarity and why I think it theoretically captures the sort of lived experiences of these young people. But first, a little bit of context. So Colombia, and particularly the region of Antioquia where I work, is a particularly interesting and suited one to explore the transformations in gang dynamics that I referred to before. We have, from sort of archival literature, the first references to gangs around the 1950s, where Medellin experienced a very rapid urbanization due to various factors linked to economic development, but also the conflict. And we see in the literature and in newspapers references to the so-called galladas, which were in fact groups of adolescents that hung out in the street, that tried to support each other. Many of them were street orphans. And it was this kind of classic notion of gang as a small peer group that engages in petty delinquency and is a kind of is tied by brotherhood ties. But then through the sort of arrival and emergence of narco-traffic, the Medellin cartel with Pablo Escobar, and later the paramilitary project, so paramilitaries entering the urban conflict in Medellin, we have seen what is often described as a co-optation of these local gangs by narco-traffic and organized crime groups. So local gangs become sort of the working arms, the local working arms of much larger structures. And this has led, through a complex development that I don't have time to go into right now, to today's gangs in Colombia looking a little bit like this. So we have at the country regional level large organized crime structure that engage in transnational drug trafficking and transnational relations. Then we have the city level in Medellin, sort of large agglomerates of sort of management agglomerates called razones. In the city area level, so a bit smaller, the so-called combos, agglomerates of gangs. And at the neighborhood level, we have these pandillas, so local youth gangs, that, however, relate to these larger organized crime structures through a sort of franchise-like model. So it means that they lend to the higher organized crime structured services, like they do the local drug dealing, they do mandated assassinations, they do tasks. And at the same time, the larger structures lend to these local gangs access to drugs, weapons, but also, very crucially, the ability to use the name of the larger criminal organizations, therefore increasing their allure and importance in the neighborhood. Now, the pandillas themselves, so the local gangs, are also structured very hierarchically. We have chiefs, sort of mid-level management. Then we have some key roles like drug dealing manager of a certain area, sicarios, specialized killers, or neighborhood watchers. And then we have a whole crowd, which is the group I really focused on, of adolescents that do a lot of ad hoc tasks, like small-scale drug dealing, being watchdogs, alerting when the police arrives, carrying drugs from one place to the other, and many, many other ad hoc tasks. And there is very little upward mobility, right, from this kind of lower level upwards. And it seemed to me that also the literature, what I was reading on gangs in certainly Latin America, failed to focus on this large gray zone around gangs of kids that perform tasks that are essential to this whole very large hierarchical structure, but that are very often not centralized in the literature and also in local discussions around gangs. These are not fully considered gang members, but rather they are involved with gangs. They work with it a bit. They're usually adolescents aged 10 to 15. They don't have a lot of importance. Certainly, they don't gain a lot of money from gang involvement, but they are instrumental to the system, and they are also the largest share. I mean, we are talking of hundreds and hundreds of kids in a single city. So these adolescents engage with the gang through what I call a flexi engagement model. This means that entry barriers are very low. I have witnessed zero reference to sort of initiation rituals and that sort of kind of clear markers of gang entrance. So as one of my interlocutors told me, it wasn't difficult at all to enter. I just went and told to the duro, the chief, and he told me, all right, if you want to hang around, and we'll give you tasks. There is no commitment. As one of them told me, I stayed at a lower, more free level. They gave me drug to sell, and I did that. But if I wanted to leave, I could leave, no problem. And they are also at this level quite free to decide whether they want to accept a task or not. It's really a service-based kind of engagement. But at the same time, this kind of flexi engagement model that has some advantages also has some disadvantages. So these kids are paid per task and in kind. So it means they don't receive a fixed pay or salary like those higher up in the structure. As one of them told me, I get paid half in money and half in drugs. If I manage to sell all the drugs, I can keep what I gained from the half that was mine, but I never manage. And so in the end, I smoke it up myself. And that makes me want more. And so I spend the little money I have on more drugs. And so in the end, I have no money left. So we can see kind of a vicious cycle of engagement that sort of makes these kids increasingly dependent, right, on this service provider, criminal service providing job. There is also individual risk bearing. So if, for example, drugs is confiscated by the police during a search, the ones to respond for this drug loss, for this merchandise loss, is not the gang, but it's the individual youth, the individual kid. As one of them told me, I still owe money to the chiefs because when the police caught me, they took the drugs away from me, and this threw me into debts. He started to develop debts with the chiefs. And yesterday, the chief told me that to pay attention because if I don't pay him back, I can lose my life. So there is an indebtment mechanism that makes these kids also economically, right, and financially dependent on these jobs. And as we saw, as this quote also demonstrates, a highest expendability of these kids. They are highly replaceable. So if they make a mistake, if they become too hot, if they are in debts and don't pay back, they get displaced or killed and replaced by some other kids. They are not essential on their own, right? So the more I thought about this sort of engagement model, the more I had to kind of draw the parallel, which wasn't there at the beginning of my theorization, but kind of emerged during the years, with gig economy platforms, right? What we see with Deliveroo, Uber, or Rapid, these sort of platforms that don't fully employ their workers, but engage with them through a sort of contractor kind of relationship, and where workers lack any right or protection or belonging to the firm, but enjoy some level of flexibility and freedom in their jobs. And of course, by drawing this parallel, I do not mean to say that they are one and the same. There is a world of difference between a delivery rider and a young adolescent drug dealer in Colombia. But what I want to highlight is that these new working arrangements, whether within the illegal or legal economy, result in apparent flexibility, but de facto exploitation of bottom-level workers. And more broadly, I think this analogy illustrates how neoliberalism, both as an economic model and as a value system, is reflected within legal but also illegal economies alike. So when I was thinking about all this theoretically, sort of the concept of precarity emerged as particularly important. And the literature has covered this idea of precarity in two main ways, right? There is an economic literature that talks about labor precarity, flexible working arrangements, lack of guarantees, and for example, economist Guy Standing theorized the emergence even of a new social class, the precariat. And I think to some extent we could say that these kids are the precariat of the criminal enterprise. But at the same time, there is a whole more ontological literature on precarity, of course, Judith Butler and others, that has theorized precarity as a vulnerability condition, as a condition of existence where your life can easily be taken away because it is devalued, because it is ungrievable, because it cannot be mourned to some extent. And we see this clearly in the situation of these young people where they have lives that are extremely expendable, that are morally condemned, and can therefore easily be eliminated even by their own criminal employers. So, and with this, I conclude, I think that through an examination of sort of the lives of these young people and their working condition within criminal economies, we can see how these two dimensions coexist, intersect, and actually mutually reinforce each other. And this is a condition that for which I have coined this new expression, augmented precarity, which I term as the coexisting and mutually reinforcing expendability of one's labor and of one's life. And to conclude, I would like to suggest that this notion can perhaps be productive to understand not only the lives of gang-involved youth in Colombia, but also more generally the lives of people working at the bottom of illegal economies, such as drug dealers, but also sex workers, cultivators in illegal plantations, all roles that are shadowed by heavy moral condemnation, substantial physical peril, and the lack of safeguards for both work and life. And with this, I conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alina. Very, very interesting. And yeah, really, there's a lot of insights to draw from it. I see we already have a question, but I think we'll keep that for the end. Okay, so next up we have Tariq Weeks. He's from the University of the West Indies, and he's a research fellow at the Center for Criminal Justice and Security at the University of West Indies. So please take it away, Tariq. Can you hear me, Tariq?
Yes, I was just trying to get my slide moving up to your, okay. Right. I think that's there now. Yes. Oops. Need to move something around. Okay. Thank you. You hear me now? I'm John.
Yep, loud and clear.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Interesting discussion so far, and I'm looking forward to the questions. So I wanted to speak about the work I've been doing somewhat, which I started in 2012 to at criminal gangs in Jamaica, right? Particularly the Kingston metropolitan region, right? And today I'm kind of focusing a little bit on organizational characteristics of those gangs, right? That I've been monitoring since 2012 and that particular space. So sort of kind of shed some light and update the local literature on organizational characteristics of criminal gangs in Jamaica, or gangs in Jamaica. It's very thin, but also to kind of contribute to a wider understanding around, what are some of the characteristics associated with gangs, right, in Jamaica, right, which are involved with certain criminal markets, right? So, I'm gonna share with you information around organizational characteristics, right? For 42 criminal groups that were identified by law enforcement. They administered a survey, which is kind of a standardized survey on street gangs used by the Euro Gang Group, which I'm a part of. And they've done a number of work into the standardizing tools in Latin America and in the Caribbean. This is the first time that we've seen this survey to law enforcement be administered, right? I started in 2021. The area that I'm focused on is considered to have one of the highest number of gangs in Jamaica, right? There's a Kingston metropolitan region, which covers Kingston, St. Catherine, and St. Andrew, which are three distinct parishes, but for contiguous purposes, they lump them into this Kingston metropolitan region. But that region had 77% in 2020 of the 262 gangs that were identified, active gangs identified by law enforcement. So a significant number, right? I hope to show supporting information, right, for the position that different gangs, different types of gangs are involved in the criminal markets in Jamaica. And when I say criminal markets, I'm referring to buying, selling, even renting particular services and goods, right, in the criminal underworld. So as you know, Jamaica has had a long history with criminal markets, exactly what I spoke about in terms of buying, selling, and renting. This is a map from 2011. So a year earlier, before I started my gang research work, and you could see that Jamaica is part of some overlapping routes, right, which I'll show earlier. I'll show later, sorry, as well. Next slide. Overlapping routes of drugs and firearms, you can see the relationship with Haiti, right? There's been and continue to be a drugs for guns trade, right, between Jamaica and Haiti, and has even gotten further to guns for meat and guns sort of meeting different demands that Haiti has, because has been, as you would know, a struggling country economy, lots of violence, and of course, if that collapses in certain provisions of goods and services. So, of course, criminals have found ways to maximize on that. A key impact in this year, I did some work on security threat assessments for one particular country in the region, and we saw the movement of people who associated drugs and firearms now offering to smuggle or be part of the smuggling network, right, between Haiti and that country, right? So they overlap. So the next slide, let me tell you something. Yeah. So the next slide is about the illegal firearms problem. So there's a movement within the region that is sort of advocating that we've sort of spent a lot of time caught up in a drugs economy narrative and a drug change narrative, when really and truly it's very small organizations very small the organizations contributing to the violence problem that the region has, right? In fact, what is the biggest problem is the illegal movement of illegal firearms within the region, which is having a devastating effect on our economies. Countries, especially like Jamaica, have had that for a very long time, one of the highest homicide rates in the region, above 6,400,000, and it's above first of all, it's above the global average of 6.2 and 7,400,000 by UNODC. It's also above regional averages of 6,400,000. So it has been there for a while, and what is sustaining it is not necessarily breakdowns in drug trafficking organizations' trust, but more so the legal possession of and access to firearms, which are weapons of choice in more than 50% of the homicides, right, recorded in the country. And it's a very layered motive, right? It's gangs and domestic violence and other contributors to this problem, right? So, okay. Yeah, so I mentioned the narco trafficking roots, and I just want to jump into the data collection approach. So I mentioned that I started this work in 2012, first as ethnographic work, try to understand community dynamics, gang dynamics, and community dynamics at community levels, particularly what was sustaining them, why certain communities for a very long time had gang presence, whilst others did not, right? What I consider to be like old and new communities. And you see it in the literature, the North American literature around this hybrid situation, and also communities that have both old and new gangs, right? But also new communities with new gangs, right? Emerging, we call it emerging communities, right? So there's this relationship in Jamaica that has been ongoing. So I started that, and in 2021, I implemented the Eurogang expert survey, right? And I found that I also had to do semi-structured interviews with that survey instrument, and that was because it did not always capture all of the requirements I wanted for understanding of the street gang situation. So in this case, for example, there are very few characteristics that organizational characteristics that it captured, and I'll talk about this later on. So what I'm presenting to you is a mixture of different techniques, right, to kind of talk about the organizational characteristics of those gangs, those things, right? I also use community researchers, something I kind of picked up on from my work as well, looking at voices to build safer spaces in Latin America, a study I was part of as well, in between 2018 and 2019, which covered 8. But Jamaica was the only English-speaking Caribbean country. All the others were Latin American countries: Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and I mentioned Guatemala already, right? Honduras as well. So I carried over community researchers the idea of co-producing that knowledge around gangs and what they're doing in particular spaces. Health sensitization meetings before the election, particularly community researchers and members of the police, to introduce them to the survey, learn from them what might need to be changed, adapted. The survey also benefited from experts on gangs who have also used the instruments in Latin America, right? And so there were some issues as well in the region. We have a problem with data, particularly around, well, first was around trust of data recorded by the police. There are many difficult histories, I would say, that are associated with that because the police have always been interpreted as being corrupt and may also sort of marginalize and deliberately marginalize particular groups. And that's the past, yeah? And that's the kind of history that was there, but there's still been trust problems. So it's good to also kind of look at what has been coming up in the newspapers to see what they capture of particular issues on gangs, and if there's any data there that could be used. So I kind of took that approach as well. So there is a modified instrument ultimately, right? And it was implemented in Latin America, and you could find some of that work published in the Journal of Criminology, right? I mentioned this already, and we looked at the selection of gang detectives, right? Persons who were sort of daily in the study, the monitoring of gangs for the police, right? And they participated in these discussions. The survey itself had 23 closed-ended questions and 10 open-ended questions. And it was administered in April 2022. And we looked back at 2021. The idea was to track every year since then, since 2021. Okay, so we had consultation forums, transit walks, and memos. Okay, so what I found amongst from the survey and certainly from the interviews and consultations I've had is that among 42 criminal groups identified by the police, which I call street gangs, they all had group leadership. Right, so there was always a coordinated face, right, of the gang, right, very present. Police will had information on those persons, right. All the groups had a name, right. Names could be a reflection of the space they were in, communities, or actually from the families and leadership that led them. All groups except for one had a vertical structure, right. When I think about vertical structure, of course, I mean that there was very clear, distinct roles from a leader to what we call middle echelons and lower echelons of persons. Middle echelons, the sort of delegation of work to the lower echelons, but they also did operational work, whilst the lower echelons of members were kind of like the workforce, right? And they would carry out murders, commit robberies, extortion activities. Right. We had interestingly, this is where it still kind of departs from some of the hybrid work. Some of the work on hybrids of gangs in North America and other parts is that we only had single ethnic composition, right, in among those gangs, and there were no foreign-born members. We also had, though, and we did observe that there were deportees making up membership of those groups, right, but no foreign-born members, right? So quickly, the age of young persons, average was 17.6 years old, right, associated with 42 groups. But what we've also understood was that you could have younger members as young as 10 years old, right, in gangs, but the mean age was 17.6 years old, right, for persons. The youngest person, the oldest person was about 33 years old, right, 34 years old. But we also found cases, very few cases, like one or two, where persons were in their 40s, right, as part of the group. So again, the combination of membership suggests, right, that you could have both old and new styles of organization, right, present in the gang, right. We also found that the age category that best describes, however, people in the gangs, most of all, were 19 to 25 years old. And so the category that best describes how long groups have lasted, of course, I mentioned 11 to 20 years. We found the mean age of most of the 42 gangs. The mean length of time, for the 42 groups was 11 to 20 years, right, in that particular space in Kingston, right, and Solange. The number of people belonging to the group, of course, very small membership we found, the mean being 11 to 20 persons, right? Again, so capacity-wise, we're talking about very, possibly very tight-knit, right? Street gangs, right, involving the criminal markets. What I have on the side is an actual map that was done in 2012 of the groups then. It was 32 criminal groups that had identified in 2012. And of course, all these areas are depressed areas, right, that they're located in, added some other characteristics, environmental characteristics. And in the literature, you can see that people often try to refer to this low economic status, right, for some of the looseness of the gangs that we see. But what we actually have seen amongst the sports groups is that they play some level of organization, right? Organization, the things like coordinating roles, role differentiation, right? What we've not been able to sort of pin down is the productivity, right? Which is what the organizational theory around gangs would suggest that, does size influence productivity? Does the style of management influence productivity, right, of criminal gang members? We have not really gotten there to that study, but we certainly in this study, I hope that it kind of pins down some organizational characteristics of social groups, right? We did not have any presence of signatures, right? I like to think of signatures as sort of like ways of identifying the gang. So no clothing, ways of speaking, no symbols like gang signs, and no other physical identifiers like graffiti and stuff that was saying that this was part of the gang. We do have some copycat behavior, right, in the space where when you look, it's not actually gangs, but possibly delinquent groups that are putting names up, right? I equated more towards like fandom. I don't particular gangs. I'm not necessarily that these gangs are in this particular game, right? So what is interesting as well is that of the 42 criminal groups, we found more, of course, a mix of violence and property offenses. That's the first thing. But interestingly, more groups were involved in robbery and contract killings. Contract killings being killings for hire, right? So just to put in perspective, small groups, 11 to 20 persons, right, existing for a period of time with old and new membership, right? These two types of primary ways of primary, illegal activity involvement, right? Robbery and contract killings. And of course, there were others, which is homicide featuring as well, right up there. And then you had rental extortion, right? Extortion coming after as that. We also had groups that involved in loads of scam. Now, one of the things that was observed was that in 2012, when I did this, there were about 11 offenses, right, that were associated groups in the area, right? And so what has increased? It has increased and also remained very stable as well. So you had seen that the table across that scrap metal, which is at the bottom, was not something we saw in the 2021 survey findings, but it was certainly there before, right? And when we didn't see lot of scamming, right, which is advanced to fraud, right? We didn't see it in 2012, right? It appeared in amongst the criminal group activity in 2021. So all of this to say is that we have a very, the gangs, even though they show very small size, right, have shown also capacity, have shown a capacity as well to engage in a sort of versatile offending, right, structure, right, versatile offending characteristics, right. They're not very specific, narrow criminal offending, right, amongst the groups in that particular region, right. They have a very, what I consider a very flexible, right, offending pattern, right, offending involved. And so overall, what I also found when I looked up was the gang surveyed, are you still seeing my screen?
Yep, we can see it, Tariq.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So overall, the gang surveyed was associated with approximately 11 illegal activities in 2021. When contract killing was identified as a main activity. So we also looked at set of combinations of offending. So one of them, for example, contract killing, when it was identified as a main activity, other gangs, like 3 of them had homicide as a secondary activity, two would have robbery, one would have rental extortion, one extortion. Of groups that were involved with rental extortion as the main activity, three had homicide as a secondary activity, right? So again, just reinforcing that they kind of have some, I will see maybe like a fallback type of offending, and maybe that is because of the heavy suppression that has taken place in the area, coming from law enforcement, just because the gang problem has getting as a priority for Jamaica, right? Given the effect it has been having on homicides, right? And other aspects of community life. And when robbery was identified as a main activity of a group, one group had shooting as a secondary main activity, and three had break-ins as there. So you just see some very few, as I mentioned, stuck in some kind of narrow criminal offending pattern. But the markets, one of the things that and just to go back to my original style, one of the things that it seems very evident is that there isn't in the criminal markets that I've seen here, there isn't a sort of exclusivity around what type of organizational characteristics are involved, right, in the criminal market. We have organizational characteristics that show at base a coordinating role and some kind of coordinating structure, but the spectrum of it is not very fully understood, right, in the organizational characteristics. And of course, right, none of the gangs met some kind of instrumental, right, corporate character, I would say. They're not focused, towards organized crime, right, or earning, right, from organized crime activity. Their participation in the criminal market and organized crime is because of a situation where they are recipients and also engaged in the trade, right? That's already taking a large trade that's already taking place across the country and in the region. But they are just distributors, right? They are also persons that have a demand for protection, right? Protection of their own services and other gangs. But they don't have, they're not purposed, right, towards, right, organized crime. But there is certainly a tipping point, right, that you have to wonder about with those criminal groups, because they do have market participation. And given the age of the persons that are involved, we do wonder about the progression of trajectory, right, if they do not get into or choose a path to the system gang activity, right? So gangs have the ability, certainly in this space, we've seen that gangs have the ability to reorganize before and after splintering, get the pressure, right, that we saw from law enforcement in the area. Gangs did reorganize after that. And one of the things as well is that the organization sometimes involved a change in name, but it also sometimes did not, right? And this is where my point about the flexibility and opportunity structures that exist came about, because they were able to also switch, right, their offending choices, what is again what's important, right? So they have some level of coordination and there is some organization, right? But we do not know how fully developed it is and what are some of the what I consider to be other characteristics. I mentioned, for example, that whilst we did see vertical structures clearly, there were just one or two gangs that also had what I consider to be horizontalization, right? Amongst themselves. So you would have an equivalent coordinated body or person, right? Kind of like what Maras devastating has going on in places like El Salvador. So with that type of horizontalization, you have sometimes a collaboration of networks, right? A collaboration of gangs. And we do see that in that particular space where gangs have formed alliances, right? So sort of pursue particular goals, right? Whether it be to take over another gang, to fight another gang, or to take advantage of a criminal market. So joint contingency theory, the gangs described can be described as flexible, and if and the involvement in offenses and criminal markets. So I think that's me, right? Thank you very much for listening.
That's great, Tariq. Very, very interesting. Okay, so we have some time left. I have a couple of questions I would like to ask, but we have one already in the Q&A, and I'd encourage all of the attendees, if they have any questions, please do write them in. So first one is, I want to ask, what do each of you think are the implications of your research around the role of resilience? This is something GI obviously works on a lot around community resilience in preventing gang entrance. And then as a second point, what about resilience in people exiting gangs, or the role, or what I think what they mean is what sort of strategies can be used in supporting people exiting gangs and starting a different life. So I'll start with Sangeeta, please.
Thank you. I think one aspect of that resilience also needs to be seen, particularly for my work, as this very individual desire of these young people to gain access to school. And one way for them to maybe find a way away from this gang is to gain that education and then to move on with other better opportunities. Yes, I think what comes in the way is really, it's difficult for people sometimes to survive, because the structure of the school and the structure of the education system does not really consider the kind of organization or the kind of life that many of these young people come from. So particularly also because all of my participants who are Bihari also have a certain connection with rural Bihar, even though they were born in Kolkata. So when they continue to go back to that rural context, then come back to an urban context, there can be times when they are sort of encouraged to drop out of school to take care of other responsibilities. So maybe families have agricultural lands in the village that they are supposed to take care of during the harvest. So many of these, travels that take place during the school year can impede that part. But one way of wanting an exit out of a gang and is probably the strength of the school and and there's immense possibility within the school, but that can only happen when the school sort of recognizes their context and their willingness to continue a school education. Yeah, I don't know if I answered it.
That's great. Okay, Alina.
Yeah, I think in the context where I work, the issue is twofold, and I think the main and most important one is an economic issue. It's a labor issue. I mean, as I said, I think involvement in contemporary gang resembles precarious jobs. In a certain way, precarious jobs that are not so dissimilar from what these kids could get, in the very kind of exploitative new companies Rappi is the Colombian version of Deliveroo, and it pays people a misery. There is very little sort of protection. So in a way, young people have options that are equally fragile, and very often the kind of criminal option is the most accessible, it's the closest geographically, it's in the neighborhood. But I think the main and most important intervention is one on the labor market, which is obviously structural and really difficult to achieve, especially in an economy that is kind of neoliberalizing more and more and stripping people of labor rights. There is another dimension that I think is the dimension of imagination, the ability for these young people to imagine that they can have a different life, because very often all they've seen around them is kind of this kind of destiny. Very often gang involvement happens because also other family members have been involved in gangs. So I think there is a work to be done on positive role modeling and helping these young people to dream a different life. But I am very critical of this work when it is done and it is not backed up by actual support to realize this life. So a lot of kind of NGO and even government projects in Colombia work with this idea of proyecto de vida, no? So they do workshops where they help young people to imagine their life project, but then there is no actual support to realize that life project, and this only causes further harm. So I think it's very important these two dimensions are tackled in tandem.
Great. And Tariq, what do you think?
Yeah, the matter of resilience, I have a very complex view. It probably is as complex as the problem itself. But of course, there are the individual levels types of appreciations we must have. One is that gang membership in particular is a form of delinquency, right? It's probably one of the worst and severe forms of delinquency that we have. But to get to gang join is not easy, right? People select into it, and some people actually have a propensity towards it. What we must do at individual levels is or target individual levels to improve on the protective factor support, right? That is available to persons who show that sort of kind of early warnings and proclivity towards violence. And so that's the individual levels, improving on the protective factor support, was minimizing the risk factors that we see, and also I consider to be improving on resiliency factors, right, at the individual level. How do people, right, overcome adversity, right? How do people overcome issues to go on to not be involved in gang members? I mean, many gang members and non-gang members are considered to be sometimes similarly situated, right? But not everyone chooses the path of a gang membership. So we need to kind of spend some more time on, getting the robust evidence around these individual level indicators. There's also capacity within the state, right? Of course, Jamaica has been, through UNODC's work, been kind of developing a counter-organized crime strategy, right? There's also anti-gang legislation, right? But there's still some work to go in terms of interventions and scaling, right? One of them is, for example, is that, and we mentioned, I mean, gang members usually require, and I think this is what the precariousness that I was speaking about kind of touches, is that gang members usually have to be rewired. Yeah, they're accustomed to early easy rewards, not working, gang taking care of them. So there is a need to sort of look at those psychosocial therapies that we see advance in other spaces. So the cognitive behavior therapy. I was actually listening to something 2 weeks ago from University of Chicago, the crime prevention lab. And, these guys talk about control, delete, right? Instead of saying it's behavior change, but something that kind of helps them get over the past and move on, but also rewiring their thinking. So we need to look at scaling up those types of interventions. And of course, tackling at the national level, those issues around making the state less susceptible to corruption, strengthening integrity checkpoints, making sure vetting procedures are optimal, right, for those who are involved or are vulnerable to organized crime penetration, right? So these are my thoughts, really. I say it's complex, right, regarding the resiliency model that should be adopted.
Yes, great. I don't see any questions at the moment, but again, I would encourage attendees, if you have any pressing questions. What I would like to ask as well is, you're all a little bit different methodological approaches, but not that different. Could you maybe comment a little bit on your methodologies, but also some of the challenges you face in conducting this kind of work? Sorry, let's do the same order again. So Sangeeta first, please.
I think my main challenge is also my own ethno-linguistic caste class intersection. I represent the same group, the Bengalis. That is the dominant ethnic group of the city, the school, and that has a history of perpetrating and violence and constructing the Biharis as a criminal people. So it's also important, I think, to note that during a pilot study, I didn't really know that the boys were organized also as a gang. So I went to the school to do a research on ethnic masculinities, but then in the process also realized that they were also organized as a gang outside the school with people who also have incriminating evidence, with a whole range of other activities. And then, I think the main challenge for me was my own location. And it's something that I'm also grappling with, because I think that research is also extracting data. So people of my location have already exploited the participants of my research over time. And I'm also aware that the processes of interviews and focus group conversations, and also the trust that is built over a period of time, because of which I now have access to a significant degree of information that I don't know whether I should have had or not. And the other thing about Indian public space, and I think also South Asian public space, is that people are not addressed by their names. So people also in the public space whom you don't know become the elder sister, the uncle, the aunt, the grandfather. So then in the school, I was addressed as this elder sister. So and over a period of time, I became that sister, the big sister who was the confidant, who could be told everything. But at the same time, it's also true that all this this trust that has been offered to me is in effect also my data. So these are also very important ethical questions that remain at the core of my work. And there are no easy answers, because as researchers of a dominant ethnic group, there is a sense of, I won't say a sense, there is a very explicit epistemic impunity when we are at the field. We are not questioned about our location and our legitimacy to access that data. So yes, I think these are at the core of my work. And yes, thank you.
We have 2 minutes left. So Alina, if you wouldn't mind keeping it to 1 minute, and same with you, Tariq.
I'll try. So I used ethnography, which is a very immersive research method, right? And following from what Sangeeta was saying, one's positionality is very important and has implications both for the safety ethical challenges, but also for the nature of the data gathered. So for me, the most striking thing was that I was a young woman doing research with young, mostly boys, adolescents. This is quite uncommon in gang research. And I think although it did sort of present certain challenges in sort of navigating gender relationships and avoiding creating excessive sort of ethnographic intimacy, right, that could lead to misinterpretation. So this was a part of the problem. But I think it also helps to provide a different read of gang experiences. I think a lot of male-conducted gang ethnography emphasizes bravado narratives that are strong and kind of brotherhood-like. And this is not false, but it's one part of the story. I think the adolescents with whom I interacted, similarly to Sangeeta, tended to see me as an older sister and with time as a confidant. And that allowed for the expression of more vulnerable and self-doubting narratives that emphasize the really precarious situation in which they find themselves. And I think this is an important counter-narrative to a lot of the gangs research that we read out there.
Right. And Tariq?
Yeah, I mean, so I use a mixture of techniques, as I mentioned. I mean, one of the things, of course, of approaching gangs, which most researchers have, is, dealing with these conflicts and tensions around definitions, right? And how do you incorporate it, without, doing justices and excluding different pieces of information that you want. So my challenge really, because street gangs is not a label that you see commonly used amongst Jamaicans. They say criminal gangs, they say corner crews, defense crews, they say organized crime groups, right? So it's about looking at, certainly you're able to solve it with maybe individual level studies where surveys is administered, and adolescents in particular has been done. Report on nominated participation, right, in particular groups. But with this type of work, where it's law enforcement, the definition overlaps kind of have to be identified and solved by yourself. How do you treat those different labels into the street gang body of knowledge? Defense crews are tough oriented. They're concerned with rivalry, but also street gangs, right? Criminal gangs, though, in Jamaica are considered to be very criminal-oriented around organized crime, right? And so it doesn't exactly fit, right? So these are some of the the challenge, I would say, that's, as a researcher, I had to kind of manage, right, those tensions and conflicts on definitions and what it actually means for putting forward those instruments and questions to persons.
Great. Okay, well, super. Well, I have two hats to wear now. So my first, as chair of the session, is just to thank our speakers. That was an incredibly interesting set of presentations, and also I think a great discussion at the end. Thank you everyone for in the audience as well for coming. Now I get to put on my organizer hat and give just some closing remarks for the conference. So firstly, just to say thank you everyone for being part of the 5th edition of the 24-hour organized crime conference on global organized crime. As we wrap up this incredible 24-hour journey, I'd just like to take a moment to reflect on what we've accomplished together. So this year's conference was built on a simple yet ambitious idea. Can we host a truly global event with participants from 6 continents and more than 40 countries in just one day? And the answer we have is, as we have seen, is a resounding yes. Over the course of 24 hours, we've had 3,000 participants joining us from around the world, with an average audience of 40 participants per session. Together, we hosted 320 speakers from diverse backgrounds, from academia to civil society, early career scholars to experienced professionals, and all with an equal voice. So we took an important step in promoting gender balance and expanding our perspectives with discussions from different regions and fields. Our commitment to innovation continued this year with new formats like documentary screenings and book presentations that inspired meaningful exchanges and new ideas. Thanks to the hard work of our communications and logistics team at the Global Initiative and our incredible volunteers who made everything run smoothly. This virtual format allowed us to gather insights, build connections, and foster a spirit of collaboration that few in-person conferences frankly could match. I would like to especially thank our speakers who adjusted their schedules to join us at all hours, showing their commitment to this global conversation. To our behind-the-scenes teams, your dedication was invaluable. You kept things running seamlessly, ensuring that everyone could engage in this shared experience. But the end of this conference doesn't mark the end of a journey together. We encourage you to carry the momentum forward by connecting with speakers and participants you found interesting. Soon we will be posting recordings and resources from the sessions on our website, and you'll also receive a survey where we'd love to hear your feedback and ideas for the future. And finally, we invite you to join our networks, GI-TOC, CIROC, and the ECPR Standing Group, so that we can continue to collaborate on addressing the global challenges of organized crime.